Welcome back to PWCI This Week. I'm the Mega Conservative Crime Fighter, and as the shutdown continues, at least in Illinois, more on that in a bit, I should call this episode Crimey at Large. The views expressed by the Mega Conservative are solely his own, do not reflect the views of family, friends, co-workers, or any organization. Part of the frustration of doing these news episodes, besides the time involved in putting together the presentation, is the speed and scope of how things are changing day to day. I had to re-record the content a few times during the week for that very reason. So let's begin with the less complicated wrestling news. At the top of the program is the announcement another of the major cornerstones of the St. Louis wrestling scene has been lost. Longtime MMWA promoter Tony Costa, real name John Castaldi, passed away on May the 4th at the age of 80. Known as Old Dynamite as a professional wrestler in the 70s and 80s before retiring and becoming the wrestling promoter at South Broadway Thug Club, Costa, in a partnership with Herb Simmons, led MMWA SICW from 1985 to 2012 and Mid-Missouri Wrestling Alliance in the years since. He was inducted into the St. Louis Independent Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2018. ACH broke his silence in an over 2-hour interview with Pierre Abernathy and Yvonne Jalistico on their Submission Squad podcast, where he detailed the t-shirt controversy, admitted he had a major meltdown, and was ashamed and embarrassed of himself, saying social media is not the place to get this stuff off his chest. The incident killed his passion for pro wrestling for a while, but finished the interview sounding like he's ready to return once events can resume. I encourage you to go listen to the whole thing, and that is linked below in the description on our YouTube channel. Rampage Championship Wrestling is apparently rebranding itself as Illinois Elite Wrestling. How do I know this? By looking at the talent announcements. It includes the signing of the biggest national laughingstock and butthurt Hall of Famer Douglas O'Shea. Yeah, doesn't scream elite to me, more like what was dredged out of the sewers. Why the rename now? Is the roster breaking away from the Root family? Are they pretending to be another company to hide the past or attempt to get back into venues Rampage was kicked out of? Whatever the reason, the coverage ban will continue to apply to this organization no matter what they want to call themselves. This may be a totally moot point, however, as I will explain later. On a prior episode, I talked about Chris Cruz calling out a PWCI poster. I also mentioned his complaint with the Maryland Athletic Commission over an ultra-hardcore match on an AEW pay-per-view. They have ruled they are fining AEW $10,000 and they must pay in 30 days. In a statement, Cruz said, "Look, the easy thing to say in response to the $10,000 fine levied on AEW by the MSAC is that it's pocket change for a billionaire. I get that, but it ain't nothing. It is public, or will be on May 20th, when the commission meets and then posts a consent order on its website and distributes it to all the other commissions throughout the country. And keep in mind, the next violation will result in a revocation of the license in Maryland and possible show stoppage in the middle of a match. The commission is on notice now that others are watching its actions. This puts AEW on notice as well and embarrasses the company. The story will have spread far and wide. It will appear in mainstream publications. This is a black eye for AEW and for the business. AEW has had a limited number of fans at its most recent televised event, and WWE will be permitted to have some fans at their Raw and SmackDown broadcasts next month. Shifting to the more complicated COVID-19 mess, we lead off with Missouri's back open for business. On May the 4th, Governor Mike Parson gave the go-ahead for live events such as concerts to resume, making it the first state to allow social gatherings since lockdown began. There are caveats. Event organizers will be required to uphold the 6 feet minimum distance between individuals and their families. However, lockdown orders are still in effect in St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield, Missouri. St. Louis in particular has no end date, but a federal lawsuit has been filed challenging their stay-at-home order. Non-essential businesses are free to reopen in most areas of the state, with dine-in restaurants and bars with limited occupancy. That means live pro wrestling events could resume relatively soon. However, at this point in time, only 4 in 10 Americans plan to go to an event without a vaccine available. The same numbers say they'll wait for a vaccine even if it takes over a year. Iowa is also back open for business in 77 counties. Dine-in at restaurants, malls, stores, fitness centers are back open with limitations at half capacity. Social, community, recreational, and leisure sporting events are still limited to 10 or fewer people. Other types of businesses, such as hair salons, will be allowed to reopen in mid-May. And in Indiana, they are facing in reopening with diners and retail opening at half capacity, increasing that in late May with social gatherings of 250 and live entertainment in mid-June, fully reopening July 4th. IWA Mid-South appears to be the first one to be holding a live event on June 18th in Albany and the 19th in Indianapolis. They will provide masks to anyone who wants one. What do those three states have in common? They have Republican governors. They also have much lower infection numbers. However, Illinois is going in the opposite direction as the fourth strictest state in the nation. Governor DENIED Pritzker finally unveiled a 5-phase reopen plan, but it was panned as excessively long and benchmarks too high. Protests against the shutdown have only grown. Another one is scheduled for downtown Springfield on Saturday, May 16th at the Capitol, with another in Chicago at the Thompson Center. Meanwhile, lawsuits are piling up on the governor's desk, challenging his authority after his most recent EO. While Darren Bailey won his court challenge 2 weeks ago, he asked to vacate the ruling to refile with additional evidence that would make his case stronger in front of the state Supreme Court. State statutes would spell out how the government is supposed to function during a pandemic are not being followed. Mike Madigan refused to call the House back to Springfield to codify, giving the governor the ability to extend emergency declarations beyond the initial 30 days. Seems like he'd rather have the governor call the shots and shut the GOP out of it entirely. The governor also refuses to call a special session, preferring to take his chances with the state Supreme Court. The Illinois Department of Public Health, who is supposed to be carrying out the Illinois Pandemic Influenza Preparedness and Response Plan, is claiming this only applies to the flu and does not apply to COVID-19, and denied the stay-at-home order is a quarantine. Yeah, right. This is a bloody semantics play, and I don't accept that. Up on the screen, a number of counties and communities have declared they won't enforce the EO, and there's not a whole lot the governor can do about it, given most officials on the local level now understand he doesn't have the legal authority, even if he passed enforcement responsibilities onto them. He can only go after state licenses. In regards to the pro wrestling scene in Illinois, the Restore Illinois plan has some very bad news. Phase 5, in which conventions, festivals, or large events will be allowed again, depends on testing, tracing, and treatment being widely available throughout the state. It also requires either a vaccine developed or treatment options readily available where healthcare capacity is no longer a concern or there's no new cases over a sustained period. Phase 4, which is a long ways off, caps gatherings at 50. Unless there's a court ruling or the U.S. Attorney General William Barr intervenes, which he has threatened to do against states that go too far, pro wrestling in Illinois may be wiped out long term. I guess I'm going to go on road trips to the neighboring states soon. Oddly, while Pritzker keeps saying it's unlikely the state fair will be held, he hasn't outright canceled it. Why, you might ask, when other fairs and festivals have been canceling left and right? Well, according to the State Fair Act, which by law Illinois is required to hold a state fair in Springfield and DuQuoin, he may not have the legal authority to scrap it. That's right, even with the large gathering ban, there's no provision in the act to cancel the fair, and if he were to try, another lawsuit is certain to come his way. We shall see. Regarding the protesters carrying signs making references to the Axis regime at Auschwitz in regards to Pritzker, the media highlighted these people as vicious racists. Pritzker is Jewish. His family fled Germany during World War II. JB helped fund a museum in regards to the Holocaust. Why did they say this? Is it just racism, or is there something underneath being missed? There actually is something. There's genuine fascists among us. They don't wear swastikas though, but they've developed several of the tactics. Most modern-day fascists are so-called social justice warriors, chronically schizophrenic snowflake types raised by helicopter parents who walk around with a flaming hot poker jammed up their rear, spending their days actively looking for something to get offended at, and viciously lash out at people. As we've watched the actions of elected leaders during this shutdown, many of them have exposed themselves as little tyrants. Tyrants are very comfortable practicing fascism when they're ones in control of it. Pritzker, being from a family who fled the Axis regime, would at least learned not to engage in any of the same actions in even a minor way his prior generation's enemies have done. They say if you don't learn history, you're doomed to repeat it. The warning from these protesters is Pritzker is practicing some of the very things his parents and grandparents fled from 80 years ago. Ironically, it was another pandemic helping fuel the rise of fascism in Europe, allowing the Axis to come to power, according to a research paper published by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. One of those things that drew a chill is the announcement of mass hiring contact tracers. Even more concerning is the new epidemiologist, who I hear is a real doofus. Contact tracing is the process of identifying people who may have come in contact with an infected person and getting them tested and isolated so they don't pass on illnesses to others. Remember this graphic I showed weeks ago showing the movements of the populace traced through your smartphones? For all the people saying the heck with this and leaving the house more and more, guess what? There's a discovery someone they think had the virus at a certain location. You were traced by your cell phone location data proving you were at that place near the same time. Then a notification through an app hits your phone saying you're now quarantined for 2 weeks because they think you have COVID-19. Also, the governor doesn't want you traveling to neighboring states to get around his EO here in Illinois because it's non-essential travel. Even though he's evacuated his own wife to an estate he owns in Florida and got mad when he was called out on it at a daily presser. Regardless, contact tracing would be one way to identify who leaves the state and quarantine them when they come back. Rich Miller, the climate capital of facts, called this paranoia. I don't believe he's a big fan of Edward Snowden. Let's put it this way, if the capability to do something as this exists, and it does, you're foolish to think they would never abuse it, because they do, and it's been documented numerous times. My advice, leave it at home before going long distances. Powering it off isn't enough because there's ways to still find it anyway. You can wrap your phone in aluminum foil, which is actually effective blocking all radio signals to it. However, there's more you have to do. This week, Google and Apple are pushing updates to your phones, adding apps to track COVID-19, and a feature to the Health app on Apple iPhones that cannot be removed. You will also have to disable off Facebook activity on your Facebook app as well. By the way, in neighboring Kentucky, a federal judge struck down Chicken Little, aka Governor Andy Beshear's ban on interstate travel as unconstitutional as it should. Wisconsin's extended stay-at-home order appears to be in trouble as its state Supreme Court, with a 5-2 conservative majority, gave Governor Tony Evers' attorneys a very rough time, likening stay-at-home to Japanese internment camps. In the worst-hit state in the country, New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo was shocked to find out that 66% of new COVID hospitalizations are people who are either retired or unemployed or not commuting to work on a regular basis. Florida, which is similar in population to New York, has much fewer cases of COVID-19, mainly because residents spend a lot more time outside. A question for elected leaders who insist on keeping stay-at-home orders in place and freaking out at people who dare protest. And these questions were uttered by John Nolte of Breitbart.com. When there's zero risk the healthcare system will crash, when there is no vaccine or cure, why is it safe to reopen in 2 or 3 weeks or a month or 3 months as opposed to right now? With no vaccine or cure, what's going to change to make things safer between today and May 30 or June 15th or July 6th? This incurable disease will still be out there waiting, which means it will be just as risky to reopen in July as it is today. So why wait? What's the benefit of waiting when waiting doesn't make it any safer? What has been a national effort to save lives, a noble effort of national unity, has been twisted by Democrat governors into something unnecessarily punitive that reeks of a partisan power play to destroy President Trump's re-election chances. Give me a better explanation, because this is the bottom line. Unless you're willing to wait for a cure, and that is at least a year away, or might never come at all. When there's no risk the healthcare system's going to crash, what is the point of waiting one more day to open the country when waiting doesn't make us any safer? And for the stay-at-home order fanatics, no one is putting a gun to your head ordering you to go to the mall or the beach. If you're afraid of getting the virus, stay home. It's your choice, but you have no right to confine me to my house. Meanwhile, those temporary hospitals that Pritzker and Lori Beetlejuice Lightfoot said were badly needed. McCormick Place now being dismantled, and some previously closed hospitals such as Beaver Hospital in Springfield never opened. $50 to $100 million were spent on them. All that money has been squandered and wasted, while unemployment claims are going unpaid in the state because there's no money left. The incompetence is incredible. Why are voters still giving higher approval numbers to these people when they show they are absolutely clueless? Is anyone actually paying attention to what's going on outside the concrete bunker? And here's the major irony. The healthcare industry is now in danger of collapsing due to it being very underwhelmed from all the other needed medical procedures being put off. A lack of patience actually taking down the healthcare industry. A note to those businesses hard-nosed about mask requirements, I'm calling out one major chain, Menards. They mandated mask wearing and banning anyone under 16 from their stores nationwide, even in places where stay-at-home has been lifted, and has actually resorted to armed guards at the front doors to enforce mask wearing. A lot of customers very angry about being forced to wear a mask or having to find a babysitter for the kids while they shop. If they can't find one, the kids sit in the car unattended. Notes are being taken which other businesses force mask wearing. They've stated they will never patronize those places ever again well after the pandemic is over. While it's their right to make those rules because they are a private business, they have to weigh how customers will respond to it. Menards, though, has gone too far, banning customers who have a valid medical reason not to wear one. If you want to know how suffering major customer loss feels from an ill-advised business decision, ask Target. When they mandated men and women shared the same restrooms that pandered to the militant, left-wing identity politics crowd, a couple million people joined a nationwide boycott where they would no longer shop there. Their stock price collapsed and it took years to recover. Target was forced to spend millions on installing single-occupancy bathrooms for customers as a compromise. Menards, well after the pandemic is over, will find out the hard way their actions have major consequences, and corporate has to explain to stockholders why people stop coming to their stores, as they will be forced to start closing some of them as revenues crater. I previously stated I despise so-called social justice warriors who are nothing but vile, vicious, low-life scum-of-the-earth thugs. These punks are useless wastes of air who are miserable, extremely paranoid losers who will never amount to anything. Now we have the rise of even more toxic sewage sludge, claiming to have some sort of humanity, but are nothing more than bullies who get their jollies paratripping, and I'll call them social distance warriors. But they aren't warriors, they're simply fascists. You probably had an encounter with one. They scream, 6 feet! Repeatedly, and get abusive with customers. Some of them actually sit on a bench, such as that hack judge Eric Moy, who has nuclear heat for throwing a hair salon owner in jail he described as selfish and demanded an apology on bended knee. The Texas Supreme Court strongly rebuked his conduct and ordered her release as the governor and attorney general got into war words with Moy and other district judges over the case. And Lori, Beetlejuice Lightfoot, got so pissed off at people who dared have a house party. She threatened to arrest people for even daring to talk about having one. Using the shouting fire in a crowd theater argument, most likely. Oh, and because she's a public official, she's entitled to have a haircut. But you can't. I do note the rise of mask rage incidents where customers get into violent confrontations, whether it be against store personnel or police officers in retaliation for aggressive mask enforcement. I would heavily discourage violence in response to mask requirements, especially after 3 people faced first-degree murder charges after shooting dead a security guard in Flint, Michigan, after an argument and service refusal ensued. I simply recommend not doing business with companies that force the mask issue and make your voices heard with elected leaders. If a store employee gets way out of line, take the photograph and make sure store owners know who they are with a filed complaint. If the store blows it off, feel free to post it online with your grievances. As for police officers who resort to violence to enforce mask wearing, if you go too far, you risk losing your career and face a civil or criminal trial. Public outcry was effective in stopping Decatur from passing an ordinance to issue fines for not wearing a mask, and Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio backed off his mask order, admitting it went way too far. Well, I wanted to get a haircut before taping the show at Missouri, but that didn't happen. Anyway, I had to get him back on the program. He is the host of America's Evil Genius on Truth Frequency Radio, TFRLive.com, Sunday nights at 10 o'clock. He's also the manager of 5 wrestlers at SICW. Travis Cook, welcome back to PWCI.
Steven, you long-haired hippie, you need to get a haircut, I'm telling you.
Yeah. A cornerstone of STL wrestling, Tony Costa, passed away last Monday. Alas, did not get to know him all that well. Any thoughts you wish to share about him?
Well, I've known of Tony Costa for about 25 years now. I used to work for him for a period of time, and I got to say, he's one of the most honest and upfront wrestling promoters you'd ever see. If he told you something was going to happen, it happened. If he made you a promise, it came through. There's not a lot of promoters you can say that about, but you can say it about him. In a more general sense, he was really one of the most consistent promoters, probably the most consistent promoter I've ever seen in my life for such a long period of time. He went back to the 1980s, I believe it was, promoting South Broadway Athletic Club, and it didn't matter what the situation was. It didn't matter if the wrestling business was going through a boom period. It didn't matter if the wrestling business was going through a downturn. It didn't matter if he had a great roster, or it didn't matter if he had a roster where 4 or 5 guys just walked out on it. And he experienced all of those things, but it didn't matter because every month he would put together a show that would draw fans, hundreds of fans, and would draw money. You could not face him. You could not give him a situation in which he would panic. You know, he never got cornered into making a wrong decision during some periods of time that a lot of other promoters around were just all over the place. He was a model of consistency, and, you know, he may not be super well known outside of St. Louis, but I got to tell you, he was probably the most consistent and level-headed promoter you'd ever meet. A whole lot of promoters, even at the national level, can learn from him.
I've always heard that South Broadway is sold out every month because the beer is cheap. Is that true?
I'm sure that doesn't work. But, you know, but hey, you know what? I've seen other places over the years that had cheap beer too that didn't do that well. I mean, it can help, but that's not your whole show.
I wanted to get you back on because you'd be better able to explain things with the Constitution. There's been a big fuss over people showing up at the protests in Michigan with rifles. Sean Hannity condemned it, but the Founding Fathers had something to say about militias and government. Could you explain that to the layman like me?
Well, you're absolutely right. And what a lot of people overlook, what a lot of people forget, is the environment in which the Constitution was ratified. We forget, or we don't teach people very often, that the ratification of the Constitution was not a slam dunk, not by any stretch. When they brought the Constitution out to the states for ratification, a lot of people in the states had some very significant concerns. And they pushed back on those. And that's why we had a Bill of Rights. That's how the Bill of Rights came about. That's how the first 10 amendments came about. One of those amendments, of course, was the Second Amendment. And the Second Amendment clarifies that the people have that right to keep and bear arms, basically meaning that the people have the right to the same amount, the same type of weaponry that the standing army does, that the government does. That was very important because the folks that the people at the time of the Constitution ratification, they had just gotten through that period with England where a strong central government and a standing army ran roughshod over them. And with the Articles of Confederation, you didn't really have that. So now, with the Constitution coming about, it was a very big ask to suggest to people, okay, we need a centralized government of some sort. We're going to have a standing army, a standing militia. I know you don't like it, but we've got to have it. But here's the caveat. You're going to have access to the same weapons and the same type of things that they do, so you can keep them in check. That's long been, I don't want to say forgotten, but it's been minimized over the years. But that's what it's all about. Now, if I had been up there protesting, would I have been open carrying a rifle? Probably not, because I usually don't open carry anyway. But I most likely would have been carrying a concealed weapon, not for any sort of political statement, but just because anytime I leave the house, I'm carrying a concealed firearm. To me, it's just like, you know, having my wallet on me or my keys on me. If I leave the house, I've got it, you know. But I think a lot of people are trying to make something out of that, saying they're trying to intimidate the politicians and the leaders. But guess what? We're a representative republic. Intimidating the leaders is the whole point.
There's a huge concern about contact tracing. Certainly there's worry about our movements documented by our smartphones being used the wrong way with the Fourth Amendment. Others call it paranoia. How do you see it?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. It's a pretty clear Fourth Amendment issue. Now, the question seems to come down to the idea of reasonable expectation of privacy. There was a court case called Katz versus United States that established the precedent within the Fourth Amendment that the government cannot warrantlessly surveil you with, you know, in a situation where you would have reasonable expectation of privacy. So saying you're going to have contact tracing and you're going to follow us around and know all of our whereabouts seems to me to be a pretty clear violation of that principle. Now, I would expect that if this goes to court, the government would argue, well, during an emergency or during a pandemic, you don't have the same reasonable expectation of privacy. But that seems a little disingenuous. Because if that were the case, if that were legitimate, then really a government could, whenever they wanted to surveil you, just declare anything an emergency, anything a pandemic. Because now, well, you don't have that expectation because we said so, and we're the ones that want to surveil you. So if that goes to court, I hope it goes that way. But really, with a lot of these constitutional questions, one thing we have to learn from this is that it's one thing to say a government is doing something unconstitutional, but it's a totally different thing to enforce it. The only way these things get enforced is if they go to court and if they get ruled on. I think a lot of these politicians, with everything we've seen these last 2 months, I think they were banking on the fact that by the time any of this went to court, it would all be over and done with, and maybe it would just go away. I think it's extremely important on all of these various issues to pursue them all the way, even after this pandemic's done with. Get them into court, get them ruled on, follow the civil lawsuits. I hope that the salon owner down in Texas follows that through, because if we start winning some judgments against these folks, these local and state governments, then the next time something like this happens, they're going to think twice before they go over the top and do this kind of thing again.
Speaking of salon owner, more recently governors are fighting with judges striking down EOs as unconstitutional. And yeah, there's a brawl between, the governor and judges over the salon owner. What is the proper balance between the executive and judicial branch during these times?
Well, that's hard to say. I kind of just explained it in my last answer, but the problem you run into is that the judicial branch is there to basically settle these matters. The problem with that is that's not a quick process. So, Stephen, if you were the governor of Illinois, sorry, but
I wish.
Well, you'd be better than the current guy.
Yeah.
If you were the governor of Illinois and you did something unconstitutional on Monday, I couldn't say, well, I'm going to sue you on Tuesday and then we're going to take it to court, and on Wednesday I have an answer. That's not going to happen. It's going to take months. It's going to take years even, especially if something goes all the way to the Supreme Court. So there's a mechanism for that, but time is the problem with it. And as I say, I think a lot of these folks in governmental roles, governors, county executives, mayors, what have you, I think they've all bet on the idea that, well, by the time it goes to court, it's all going to be over with anyway. We're already going to have gotten what we wanted. What they may be miscalculating on, I hope, is that people will follow through on these lawsuits even after this is all over with, so that when you do start collecting some significant judgments against these municipalities and towns and states, you're going to have precedent that, well, we can't do this the next time because we can't afford to do it.
When Missouri opened up, apart from St. Louis County, what'd you do the first week?
Well, I'm just now getting into that, actually, because as we're talking on Friday night, this is the first weekend of all of that. So I've been working most week, didn't really get a chance to go into St. Charles County and do much. But I did today. I went down to a local sporting goods store out there in St. Peter's. And this is the first time I've been out there in a couple of months where they weren't restricting how many people went in and so forth. So you had a lot of shoppers there. Maybe 60% of them were wearing masks. A lot of us weren't. I was not. But everything was going swimmingly, and they were doing some social distancing and so forth. But it went fine. I can tell you that tomorrow I plan on going out and sitting down to a freaking steak tomorrow, because I haven't gotten to do that in 2 months. So even though St. Louis County is still an unfree area, I live just a few miles from St. Charles County, and I plan on spending some money out there. I wonder if Sam Page has thought of that.
And I'll be heading across the border this week to get that haircut. Travis Cook, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Stephen, to get that haircut and get a real job. There you go.
Until next time, this is the Mad Conservative Crime Fighter. The spin is making me dizzy.